Jeremy DeSilva.
That's right.
If I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm assuming that's in English. That's Jeremy DeSilva. I don't know. Is that
of the woods?
of the woods?
Of the woods. Yeah. Apparently, my ancestors inhabited forests. Who knows?
Are you sure that you're not making that up? That's a coincidence. That's very cool.
Well, I mean, maybe it's just coincidence then that I study, Artopithecus and Australopithecus and right, and the
It's
exit
like chicken
from
and the egg. Chicken and egg, which came first? Your name?
That's right.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, for joining me on what is a labour of love of mine. I just have to say that very clearly at the start, because labour of love equals no cash. There's no fee, I'm afraid. Hopefully I made that clear in the preamble.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
just want to clear it up right at the start. What I will do is, if I ever make £1 million or bucks in American off the podcast, I'll go back and back pay all the guests. That's my promise. All right.
Deal.
We can get some sponsorship, maybe.
Right.
A bit of sponsorship from Ancient Craft or the Smithsonian. They probably got a load of money, haven't they? I don't know.
Well. Yeah, exactly. Public funding for science education, science in general, is not always the greatest. So.
I've just noticed your amazing collection of skulls on the back there. Now that's, if you said that on a different kind of podcast that wasn't about human prehistory, might be a bit ominous and scary. Jeremy, if you're listening to this, it's not like in a serial killer way. Studies
right.
this, and there's an awesome. I'm too distracted by it now, Jerry. But I will do the intro. I mean, just to let you know, obviously we've spoken via email. I'm doing this podcast because I've come to my love of human evolution, human prehistory, really late on in life. I say, well, I'm 38, so fairly late on. Last couple of years, so never took an interest in school. I didn't necessarily take much of an interest in school in general. So never studied it. And I now have sort of managed to blag myself a career in another area. And I'm constantly wishing I could go back. I'm constantly Googling online courses in this. Can I really take 2 years? I can't. My wife would kill me. It's not necessarily a possibility at the moment, unless the podcast makes $1 million. Then we're laughing.
That's right. Yeah.
So I've started this really because I also like talking to people. I learn a lot through people, and this is a great opportunity, stroke excuse, to get people such as yourself with fantastic wealth of knowledge and experience in that area to talk to little old me. So,
sounds great.
Yeah, excellent. So, Jeremy, you sent me a couple of things, which I was really grateful for in the lead up to this. And one of them was the book on Charles Darwin.
The title is a most interesting problem, which stems from a line in a letter that he had to Alfred Russel Wallace when Wallace asked him about human evolution. And he said, well, that's the most interesting problem for the naturalist. He called it the highest and most interesting problem for the naturalist.
Which I mean, he was right on lots of stuff. I'd agree with him there.
Yeah, exactly.
Now the book, one thing that was really interesting, you wrote the preface or preface. Again, is that American preface?
Preface, yeah, in America, but yeah.
It might be in English, to be fair. I might just be saying the word wrong. That's very likely sometimes, the preface. And I loved the idea and the sort of story in there about Darwin kind of basically being given this Neanderthal skull when he was feeling pretty ropey and rough, and just kind of, it is a nice skull, and sort of not being that fussed about it, it sounded like. And I just wondered if you could go back now, would you shake him and say, Charles, have some Barocca, have some medicine, that this is quite important?
Kind of, and I mean, I study these things. This is what I do. I study, I'm a paleoanthropologist, so I study these fossilized remains, and here we have sort of the icon of evolutionary science, who, in his defense, studied pigeons and dogs and barnacles and climbing plants much more than he did humans. And so, I had always thought or always assumed that he just never encountered human fossils. Most of them were discovered long after he died. And in his time, Cro-Magnon had been found. There were some Neanderthal bones that had been found, but nobody really knew what they were. 1856 was the naming of Homo neanderthalensis, but it wasn't one of those things that was then adopted by the scientific community for a little while. So, I'm not a Darwin historian at all, so I just assumed he had never encountered early human fossils. And then I read this story that he had, and that really struck me, that he had available to him, literally in his hands, evidence for human ancestry, which would have been so useful writing Descent of Man. And it doesn't appear in Descent of Man much at all. He really didn't recognize what was in front of him. And I thought that was a really good way to sort of introduce the idea that you can only work with the evidence you have at the time. And Darwin did the best he could with the evidence he had. And new evidence is sometimes really hard to recognize as being important or being sort of the kind of important in a way that it would shift our understanding of our history, unless you have context, right? And so how is he supposed to recognize the importance of this fossil if he doesn't have others to compare it to? If he hadn't studied hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of human skulls to see normal variation, he hadn't. And it was covered in matrix still, so some of the obvious features were obscured. And like you said, he felt awful. And that's the other point that I wanted to make, was that science is a human enterprise. And there are times we get things wrong because we just feel lousy. Or there are times we get things wrong because we try to do it on our own, and we don't involve collaborators who may have different interpretations of the data, or we're incredibly biased, which we end up seeing in some of Darwin's later chapters, in how he handles biological diversity, both racial diversity and sex differences. That as a white man, he comes at this with considerable bias, and boy does it show.
I think that's a really such a good story to, I guess, identify some really interesting and I think quite enticing elements of prehistory. Certainly for me personally, when you learn about the past, I remember again, one of the things that put me off history at school was everything was very kind of, this is what happened. So King Henry VIII did this, did that, did this. And they never told you at the start, and maybe that I was just being ignorant and wasn't paying a lot of attention, but they didn't really make a thing of the fact that if you check a different source, the history might say differently. History's written by the victors, all those kind of ideas. With prehistory, it's that times a million, because you've got a fragment of skull that can introduce a completely different species. As you say, I think you mentioned in the preface that 150 years later, the amount of evidence that you guys have available is just huge, isn't it? It's so vast. I didn't realize that it was only kind of 2 skeletons they'd even kind of found back then when Darwin was around. So
give or take. And again, they didn't know how to interpret them. And there were folks saying that these were diseased, pathological modern humans. And so, when you only have a small sample, oftentimes in our field, the default has been, when you find something really strange, the default has been to call it pathological. because you don't know how to fit it into this framework you have. And maybe the framework's wrong. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe you're thinking too linearly, or maybe, the order in which evolutionary events happened is a little off. But I think what you're getting at, which is, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, have you ever had that in your career where you've been kind of working within a particular frame or understanding and actually gone, oh, bugger, hang on.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's beyond thrilling. And it's happened a couple of times, both with Lee Berger discoveries. Lee makes these really extraordinary finds in South African caves. And the first of which is called Australopithecus Sediba. It's about a 2 million year old relative of Lucy's. It's an Australopithecus, but it lived more recently. It lived 2 million years ago. At least the skeletons we have are dated to about that age. And when I first started working on this material, I had just finished my PhD thesis on the foot and ankle of ancient apes and then hominins. And I knew what the foot of an Australopithecus looked like. I'd seen all the material. I'd been to South Africa and Eastern Africa. I'd looked at all these fossils. I'd measured them. And so I hear about this new Australopithecus, and Lee and a colleague of his, former student Bernard Zipfel, who was a podiatrist in a former life and got sick of fixing people's bunions and decided to go into paleoanthropology. So he knows feet really well. And he and I hit it off the first time I was in South Africa, and they invited me to work on this material. And I said, oh yeah, no problem. I've got these large data sets, just send me, casts, and I'll take my measurements and I'll plug them into the graphs, and we'll fire out a paper. Because I knew what these things were going to look like. Australopithecus was an Australopithecus was an Australopithecus. I was so wrong. I was dead wrong. When I had a chance to look at the fossils for the first time, they were stunning. They were stunningly different than what I expected, especially I actually have the heel of this right in front of me right now. So the heel of this creature is very, very small and narrow and tapered, especially at the bottom there. And in humans and in Lucy and her kind, they have these big puffy heels. And that's going to be adaptive for distributing forces through the heel when you're heel striking biped. And so I just assume that if you're going to be a heel striking biped, you need a big heel. And this calcaneus, this heel, was shockingly primitive. It was shockingly ape-like. And yet it was cemented together. It was attached to an ankle that was much more human-like. And it was one of those situations where if these bones had been found in different parts of the cave, I might have been making the case that there were two different species there. But no, they were cemented together fortunately. This was the foot from a single individual. And then other bones of the foot, other bones of the leg were peculiar. And so it took us years to try to figure out what was going on. And we've now hypothesized that what this all means is that this species was walking in a biomechanically different way than humans do today. And then even Australopithecus, other species of Australopithecus were doing.
In terms of bipedalism, which is where that kind of work on the foot is so important, I guess, is to figure out when we developed as a two-legged animal, a two-legged species in terms of where we spend most of our time. Australopithecus, was Lucy is Australopithecus africanus, is that right? Or
Afarensis. Yep. But there is an Africanus, which is down in South Africa. That's actually the very first one that was ever discovered.
Would that be the first that we think would walk upright for most of the time, or was that later on? Was that Homo erectus?
No, I think that's right. That's how I interpret the fossils. Is that what I tell my students is that you can think about human evolution sort of in these three chunks, and it definitely sets you up for linear thinking, and you want to avoid that because it's much more complicated than that. But as a starting point, when you're just trying to get the big picture of human evolution, there are these what I think of these three chunks from about maybe 4.5 to 6.5 million years ago, or say 4 to 6 if we're going to simplify it and cut some corners. They're a group of early ancestors of ours, best represented by a skeleton from Ethiopia called Artopithicus Ramidus. And it shows that these creatures could move on two legs occasionally, but they also had big grasping toes in their feet, and long arms and long curved fingers. These were, so comfortable in the trees. But we know they're ancestors of ours because they have the capacity for some bipedal locomotion, and also they have small canine teeth. And that's what, humans compared to chimpanzees, gorillas, we have these really weird, tiny fangs. And you see that early on in the lineage, Artopithecus, but they're very ape-like in all sorts of other ways. So there's a lot of argument about where they fit. But then you're right, that next chunk from about 2 to 4 million years ago, that's the time of Australopithecus. And there are many, many different kinds of them. We've never found them outside of Africa. They're just Eastern and Southern Africa. And it looks like maybe even Central Africa. There's a jaw from Chad that's from an Australopithecus. And so that's a huge range. Africa is enormous. So that's a huge range that these occupied. They fill different niches. And yeah, they look like they sort of adopted committed terrestrial bipedalism. They probably still slept in trees at night to get away from predators, go up into trees occasionally, grab some food. But for the most part, to get from point A to point B, they're moving on the ground on two legs. But it looks like there were all these different ways that these Australopithecus species were walking. There wasn't just one way to move around. And then at 2 million years, maybe even a little further back than that, you start to get our own genus, the evolution of our own genus from Australopithecus, and that's genus Homo, where we get longer legs, larger bodies, larger brains, greater reliance on technology, expansion out of Africa, right? But still, it looks like species diversity, where you have, the other big surprise that I worked on was something called Homo Naledi, which, geez, that thing, its bones to me looked like they should have been 2 million years old. They looked like a good ancestor to Homo erectus, small brain, relatively small brain. Here's a skull. Yeah, so this is Homo Naledi. And the brain size is pretty small. The teeth, though, are quite Homo-like. It had long legs, but the joints are all small. The feet look human-like, but they don't look like they're well arched. Although that's still something we're trying to figure out. And so I would have thought this thing was 2 million years old, again, if you think linearly, but it turns out they're only about 250,000 years old. I was off by almost a factor of 10. So they're much more recent. And it means that, with the genus Homo, there was all this experimentation going on, all these different populations and different species. And the real question now we have to ask is why just us? Why, for the first time in our lineage's history, there's just one, as far as we know, there's just one upright walking hominin, and that's us. And why that is remains sort of a mystery, a fun mystery.
That's bizarre, isn't it? That there's so many different branches of species, and we were the only ones left at the end. I mean, are we just horrible? We killed them all? Did we just sleep with them all until we all became one sort of super species?
So that's part of it, right? And we actually have some data now from ancient DNA extractions from Neanderthal bones and bones of a population that we call the Denisovans in Asia, that these groups were absorbed into the human gene pool. You had these, maybe some degree of genetic isolation in Europe and the evolution of Neanderthals, same in Asia with the Denisovans, and then Homo sapiens evolving in Africa. And as we expand out of Africa, we absorb those populations. So where'd they go? Well, they kind of are, got pulled into us. And so they're part of our legacy now. But these other things like Homo Naledi in South Africa, the Hobbit, Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, which I've got the Hobbit too. I can just show you how ridiculously small the skull of this thing is. And this is in comparison to, so here's the oldest Homo sapiens we have from Morocco. And here's Homo floresiensis. Look at the brain difference.
I've seen Lord of the Rings, so they look It looked about right.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what Bilbo was. And by rights,
That's
Bilbo
right.
should have been a plonker then if the brains were that much smaller.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and so I have a hard time believing, and maybe I'm wrong, but I have a hard time accepting that there was interbreeding that would have absorbed that population into Homo sapiens. So then do we just outcompete them for resources? Are we just better at extracting food from our environment, and then they slowly reduce population size and eventually went extinct? That's not as sort of I think as glamorous as warfaring Homo sapiens coming in and wiping out all these ancient human populations. But we have no physical evidence that we did that. Their bones don't have any cut marks or anything like that.
We know that humans have the ability to change an environment, wipe out everything else in that environment without directly killing them. So I guess maybe there's something in that. It's interesting. Because for my job, I'm quite involved in sort of keeping up to date with neuroscience that kind of filters down through working with neurodiverse people with autism, ADHD, stuff like that. So I've got a bit of an interest in, I guess, evolutionary psychology and the cognitive development. And it seems like it's almost like the physical developments were kind of going all over the place, were getting refined. And then when we had a brain that could adapt the environment around us, like tool use, we didn't need to get any better with those physical adaptations. Is the human foot the best one?
Oh, that's a great question. So this is something I've thought about quite a bit, and some insight into this comes from the field of robotics, where and prosthetics for that matter, where if you tackle this from an engineering standpoint, if you've got a mind that sort of thinks, okay, here's the problem I need to solve. How do I design something to get there? You don't design the human foot. You absolutely do not design something, even if it's going to move bipedally on two legs. It doesn't look like the human foot. You don't have 26 individual parts, because each foot has 26 bones in it. So we've got 52 foot bones, which means a quarter of your skeleton is made of foot bones. And what you need your foot to do is to be flexible enough to adapt to the surface you're stepping on, but then rigid enough to then push off the ground into your next step. If you look at the blade prosthetic that some people have to, when they've had an injury or are born with a congenital defect and they need a prosthetic, that blade prosthetic, it's a single piece. And what it ends up resembling is the foot of an ostrich. And so ostriches, big terrestrial birds,
they could shift as well.
Oh yeah, they've reduced the number of foot bones that their ancestors, so that their dinosaur ancestors, right, had more foot bones. They fused those bones together. It's something called the tarsometatarsus. So their ankle bones and their metatarsals, the bones sort of in the middle part of the foot, have all fused together, and are sort of taking that path towards a better engineering design, as natural selection is favoring that, right? But that's a 250 million year process, where their ancestors, the dinosaur ancestors, are slowly evolving and having these subtle foot modifications, especially in those that are more terrestrial and bipedal. And many dinosaurs were. Think about T-Rex, right? T-Rex was two-legged. It was bipedal. You compare that to humans, and first, what is our starting point? Our starting point is an ape foot. It's a foot that needs to be mobile. It's a foot that needs to be able to grasp onto tree branches, because if you're a big primate and you fall from the trees, you're in big trouble. So having a mobile foot to grasp onto branches, that's our starting point. And now you have to modify that foot through natural selection to stiffen it up. And that's been accomplished through not bone fusion, but ligament thickening, the changing of how certain muscles move through the foot, and just really a co-option of the material that, the raw material of an ape foot has been modified into a human foot. And what do we have? Well, you have something that's just good enough to get us from point A to point B, but we're super slow and we're really unstable. And God, do we have foot problems, right? I mean, who doesn't have foot problems? Plantar fasciitis and collapsed arches, and we're vulnerable to ankle sprains and bunions. And so, yes, some of that is because of, shoe wearing and the fact that we're not, moving over rough terrain and really toughening up our foot from the time we were kids. But we can tell from the fossils that our ancestors also had problems.
I was going to ask you about, did they have bunions? Did we have ancient?
So I've never seen ancient bunions. That's a really good question. And there are, we can look at modern human populations that are unshod, right? People that don't wear shoes. And bunions can happen. And so shoes, are not the ultimate cause to it. There's probably some genetic predisposition. But then bunions are exacerbated if you wear shoes, especially the ones that, our shoes are ridiculous, right? We have the furthest point right in the middle, when the biggest of our toes is actually the big toe. I mean, the furthest point should be.
No, I've got spade feet. I have to wear only Nike Air Force Ones, because they're the only ones wide enough for my feet. And if Nike Air Force One want to sponsor the show, then we can,
there you go.
Sort that out. So they're really good for my big spade feet. Their shoes are just so badly designed, aren't they, for our actual? But then it's aesthetic, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to shoes, right? And it communicates your socioeconomic status. And when I was a kid, it was about Air Jordans, right? Who could get the Air Jordans? And that meant you had the money to do it. And anyway, there's a lot that goes into shoes besides just covering up your foot. But even before we were wearing shoes, the foot fossils that we have show evidence of, healed ankle fractures. There's this amazing skeleton that was discovered by Johannes Haile Selassie in Ethiopia. And it's a skeleton that has the nickname Katanumu, which means big guy in the Afar language. And it's because it's a large skeleton, individual that would have been 5.5 feet tall or so, which is pretty big for 3.5 million years ago. And the amazing thing about the skeleton, though, so you can think of it as like a male version of Lucy. And what's just, to me, mind-blowing about the skeleton is that he has a healed ankle fracture.
Healed?
So healed, right? So imagine 3.5 million years ago, right? Yeah. You're I don't know, you fall out of a tree, or you're running and you step in a ditch and you twist your ankle and you break it, right? No hospitals, no doctors. There's not even controlled fire yet. Like, you should have died. You should have been left for dead, right? Leopard food. But no, this individual survived. And so the thing that I think is, back to what you're saying about the connection between cognition, behavior, and then our anatomy, is I think that our anatomy in some ways continues to be sort of not the best solution and problematic, because we buffered ourselves behaviorally against the pressures of natural selection by taking care of each other, right? So, I mean, we do it to an extreme now with medical interventions, and here I am with glasses, right? I wouldn't be able to see the leopard. I should have been eaten. But I think it was already happening. I don't think this is a Homo sapiens thing. I think this was already happening millions of years ago. They were taking care of each other and helping each other if there was a bad injury. And I think the bones tell us that.
If an ostrich rolls its ankle running at 70 miles an hour or whatever it is, they're buggered, aren't they? They're not going to figure it out. They're dead. They'll just sit there.
That's right. And it shows you that bipedalism itself makes you particularly vulnerable to injury, because if a zebra does the same it still has 3 legs that it can move around on. You know, there are plenty of dogs and cats that can get around fine on 3 legs. And I've seen injured, you know, antelopes and zebras, and they can still move with the herd, and they're limping. You know, we've got a lot of deer here in Vermont, and I see them limping around occasionally. And you know, maybe those are the ones that end up being coyote dinner, but you know, maybe not. So having, you know, being quadrupedal, you know, you lose the 1 leg and you still have 3. Bipedalism, you lose 1 leg, you've got 1. You're now on a pogo stick, right? You can't do it. So right, us and then your ostrich, but an ostrich can't roll its ankle because it doesn't have the superposition of the talus on top of the calcaneus. So the 2 bones of the foot, the ankle bone, the talus, and then the heel, those migrated in early mammalian evolution. So only mammals have what we call a subtalar joint, or a joint where you actually could turn your ankle like that. So ostriches have this really rigid ankle that, sure, if they step in something and turn it, it's gonna, you know, there's no joint there, so the bone would just break. And yes, that would be catastrophic for that animal.
I've got another random question for you, but it's going to take some backtracking on my part. So the question is, when do you think hominids first started kicking things? And so I want you to use your knowledge of the evolution of the human foot to when we might have been able to kick things. But I'm going to posit that we know that lots of animals, particularly, like, there seems to be a correlation between the more, I guess, how we would consider socially intelligent an animal, the more they play as kids, right? Now, I've got a 1-year-old, well, he's about 14 months now. He kicks stuff, and he's just started to, you know, obviously, I think he's going to play for Man United, and we're going to be on, again, money. It's all about the money for me, as you can see. But so that inclination to kick stuff in a playful manner just to see if you could, my theory is actually that could have been around in much earlier species that were mildly social in comparison to us. So when would the human foot been able to boot something? I guess they wouldn't have had anything to boot, actually, mainly rocks. But we've all kicked a rock, haven't we?
Yeah. So where my mind goes with this, and I don't know, it's a great question, and I don't really I don't have a good answer for you, but where my mind goes is back when I was doing my PhD work, I had a chance to go to the forests in Western Uganda and study chimpanzees. And I was really interested in how they climb trees and what their feet and ankles do when they're climbing, and how it differs from our feet and ankles when we walk, and also when we climb, because humans can still, you know, occasionally climb. And one of the things that the chimps would do when they got really animated, they get super excited about something. Sometimes it's when, you know, 2 not rival groups, but when 2 groups of chimpanzees, maybe the individuals hadn't seen each other in a little while, and they come together again and they get all excited. Or if they, you know, one chimp is kind of throwing almost like a testosterone tantrum where it's usually a male, and big show, exactly.
Yeah.
And what they'll do is they'll kick the buttresses of these big fig trees. So they're these huge fig trees. And when they kick those buttresses, it's this booming echo. It's this really impressive part of you know, this performance. It's almost like a drum beat, right? And so, you know, seeing that in chimps, I haven't, you know, studied other apes in the wild, so I'm not sure, but I would imagine there's probably kicking involved in those guys too. It's probably something that is shared, you know, with our common ancestor, and that we've always had the capacity for it, and we've always done it. And boy, what a useful, as a biped, what a useful thing if you're having to ward off a predator, to be able to kick it. You know, giraffes kick lions. You know, kicking is a good way. Of course, kangaroos. Kicking is a good way to defend yourself. And you know, there's no way we're going to outrun something. And so, if a big saber-toothed cat emerges from the bushes, or some ancient leopard pops out of the bushes, or a big hyena, and you're out of options, right? Then throwing rocks, kicking it if it gets close, that's certainly mobbing it. I think we probably would my guess is we lived in large groups, and if we found a predator, we would attack it. We would go on the assault, and surround it and throw rocks at it and mob it, and it would just say, well, the heck with this, and go and try to find something else to eat.
Well, there's that tribe that I think I spoke with Brianna Hogner about, but that tribe that kind of get in a line and chase off lions. Have you seen that?
No, I haven't.
So it's this tribe in Africa, and they find their meat by getting in a line together, and they approach the lions on the carcass, and they sort of fan out so they look bigger. And the lion, it chases the lions off, apparently. So they chase off lions.
Amazing.
I'm conscious that one of the, I guess, only things in this for you is obviously to be able to get a few people maybe to find out more about your book. So, and I've just chewed your ear off about the foot for ages. So
yeah, the book is called A Most Interesting Problem.
Most Interesting Problem.
Yeah, and the subtitle, which says it all, is what Darwin's Descent of Man got right and wrong about human evolution.
Okay, so because I've probably gone into the time too much, let's try a quick fire.
Sure.
What did he get right or wrong?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so
let's do it.
Survival of the fittest.
So his ideas of evolution by means of natural selection have been robustly supported by 150 years and now more, because that came out in Origin of Species, of evidence by the scientific community. It depends on how you define fittest, though. And I think a lot of folks will hear survival of the fittest and think biggest, strongest, most aggressive. And one of the things that Darwin wrote about, and that a lot of folks are realizing now, is that it doesn't always mean that. And of course, evolutionary biologists, will say till they're blue in the face that adaptations are all about what allows an organism to survive at that moment in that environment. And maybe it's being small and quiet, maybe it's being big and loud. And so, there's no sort of one size fits all for what we mean by fittest. But there's some great work happening now that's showing that cooperation was absolutely, or can be, a critical variable in the survival of organisms. That Darwin's survival of the fittest was sometimes misinterpreted as sort of, this selfish, you're on your own kind of idea. But then how does that explain sociality? How does that explain cooperation? How does that explain altruism? And what we realize now is that in social animals, being cooperative and helping each other out benefits not only self, but it can benefit other, or not only other, but it can benefit self. And sometimes because you're genetically related to that individual, and sometimes not. Sometimes there's this sort of tit for tat that I help you and eventually you help me down the road.
So fitness is a bit of a strange term, isn't it? It's not, the Homo sapien that sat at home on a computer game eating loads of Doritos that's 50 pounds overweight, but they're still alive, is as fit
that's right.
as anyone else that's alive.
Yes, and fitness does have a specific definition that involves having offspring. And so
as long as they're getting their end away.
That's right. So if that Dorito eating guy has a couple of kids, then whatever behaviors, anatomies, whatever, anything that had a genetic predisposition to them led to that, then yeah.
I've got a kid now, so I can let myself go.
There you go. That's right.
No, that wasn't, to be fair, and it was a difficult challenge. There's two issues I've got, Jeremy. The first, it wasn't a very quick fire answer. It was a very good one.
Sorry.
No.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
But also it's a trick question. I Googled this before, and Darwin never said survival of the fittest, apparently. It was Herbert
So,
Spencer. Well, this is what I read on Google. And I'm not,
yeah.
But,
So what's really fun is that in Origin of Species, Darwin never uses the word evolution, and he never says survival of the fittest.
doesn't say evolution.
And that doesn't even say evolution. That's right. So the term evolution is used by Darwin. He says evolve, but the term evolution is not used by Darwin until Descent of Man. He uses it for the first time on page 2 in the introduction. He talks about evolution. And in Descent of Man, which we're at the 150th anniversary of Descent of Man. That's why we did this sort of this book. He adopts the term survival of the fittest from Herbert Spencer. So Spencer, you're right, was the one who coined it. And then Darwin thought, well, hey, I kind of like that, and used it in Descent of Man. Yeah.
There you go. Now, apart from the terrible setup in terms of his I mean, that hair, what he's got, like a sort of, he's got a full Shakespeare on the top, slipping off the back, big beard. I'm sure it was the look of the time, but
yeah,
it's not one that I'd trust massively. But aside from that, what did he get wrong? He didn't know so much that is it such a thing as getting it wrong, or is it just, well, he just didn't know that?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of ways to tackle it. There's sort of the scholarly, what did he get wrong? And so, when I study the origins of upright walking, there's a whole lot. He said, look, humans are closely related to the African apes. The earliest human fossils are probably going to be found in Africa. And check, right? He got those right. And when colleagues were at the time, and even soon after, were indicating otherwise, that maybe it was Asia, maybe even Europe. So he was right on that. But one of the things he saw in the human, comparing humans to the African apes, was that we had larger brains, smaller canine teeth, smaller fang teeth. We were tool users and tool makers, and we were bipedal. And he saw these as being interconnected. And he said, okay, those individuals who happen to be more bipedal are going to free the hands. With those freed hands, they can use tools as weaponry and whatnot. By using tools, you no longer need the large canines, so those are going to shrink. And then you can extract more resources, and you're going to get enlarged brains. And so he saw these 4 things as being almost like a suite of features that would evolve in concert with each other. They didn't. We know now from the fossil record that tools and brain enlargement happen much later than bipedalism. And so, did he get the sort of the 4 ingredients right? Yeah, he did. Did he get the order right? No, he didn't. But how was he to know without, a Lucy skeleton that would show that bipedalism long preceded brain enlargement? And that's why I think, he would have been absolutely thrilled to, people have asked me, what would you show Darwin, or what would you tell Darwin if you had that chance? And it would be Lucy. I would show him, a skeleton of an Australopithecus. Here's something that walks on 2 legs, but has a small brain, and is maybe dabbling with technology a little bit with stone tools, but not like what you see later in, say, Homo erectus. Another application that he got wrong was in Descent of Man, it's really 2 books. He talks about human evolution, but in Descent of Man, that's when he introduces sexual selection, which is this absolutely brilliant insight that explains a lot of the things that can't be explained through natural selection. For instance, the feathers of a male peacock make him more vulnerable to getting eaten by a tiger. So natural selection just isn't going to explain that. And Darwin was able to come up with this idea of sexual selection. But he then applied sexual selection to all sorts of aspects of the human condition, including variation in skin coloration. And he's wrong. We know now that skin color variation is actually just plain old-fashioned natural selection. That it's a tug of war going on between vitamin D production, which is going to be facilitated by UV rays from the sun. So you need UV light exposure. But then UV light also can damage and destroy folic acid, which is going to be problematic for growing a healthy baby. And so you need to protect yourself from the UV light in that case. So depending on where you are on the Earth relative to UV light intensity, you're going to have this sort of tug of war going on between having pigmentation in the skin that lets in enough UV light for vitamin D production, but blocks enough that you can protect your folic acid. And this is an elegant idea that Nina Jablonski at Penn State has articulated much better than I just did. So Darwin was wrong on that. But again, I don't fault him for that at all. In the first case with bipedalism, he didn't have the available evidence. In the second case, he proposed a testable hypothesis. And that's what we are supposed to do as scientists is given the evidence we have, propose ideas and understand that we might be wrong, that new evidence or new ways of thinking might cause us to have to revisit those things that we thought were right. And so I think in both those cases, Darwin would say, oh, cool, all right, well, that's what I thought. And it turns out that I was wrong. What he really got wrong was his interpretation of human races and human race differences and human sex differences. And here, it wasn't just an absence of available evidence. He had surrounding him plenty of evidence that human races could not be organized hierarchically. In fact, Darwin himself was the one that caused us as a scientific community to break away from hierarchical thinking and to do more tree-based thinking. And yet he fell right back to hierarchical thinking when he was dividing humans up into races. And who is the top race? Well, it's it's white folks, and not just white folks. It's
racist, sexist,
men.
like everyone, like everyone else.
That's right. Yeah, and so reading Descent of Man. Reading Descent of Man is such an interesting emotional exercise because you read through it and you see these brilliant passages that you just shake your head and wonder, how did he have this insight? This is amazing. This is an out-of-the-box thinker. This is somebody who just makes these wonderful observations and asks these amazing questions about the world. And then you flip a couple pages later and he just falls right back into the same old Victorian era, white male superiority thinking. And it's like, come on, man, you're an out-of-the-box thinker and you just couldn't get there. It is. It's hard to read. And I'm a white male reading it. My female colleagues reading it, really, a colleague of mine, Holly Dunsworth, who wrote the chapter on human sex differences in this book and did a brilliant job. She, in a recent interview, described Descent of Man as the pits. She said, look, this book's the pits. Because, the way Darwin describes women it's embarrassingly problematic. I'll give you a line. He says in his chapter 19, man is more courageous, pugnacious, and energetic than woman and has a more inventive genius.
Oh, Christ.
Right. Yeah. He just comes right out and says it.
Not ideal, is it? Oh, Darwin.
And like, okay, so his daughter, Henrietta Darwin, copy edited Descent of Man. So his female daughter was good enough to copy edit Descent of Man, but she doesn't have a more inventive genius than men.
Oh, but she should have. Right? She should have gone, Dad. You've got to take that bit out. Like, come on.
And I wonder if I wonder what she was thinking. I wonder if they had those conversations. It's again, I'm not a Darwin historian, so I don't.
No, and I'm not a Darwin apologist because I've only just learned that he was that way inclined anyway, really. But it was a very indoctrinated idea at the time, wasn't it? And it's like you say, it's a shame that someone with such a forward-thinking mind couldn't go, hang on, this bit seems like it might also be twaddle as well. I wonder how disappointed you'd also be if you showed him Lucy and and he kind of said, "Oh yeah, you know, that's great. I've got a bit of a cold though, and I'm gonna and also your secretary's got a nice ass." Like,
right. Right, and look, we've had people, kind of come back at us a little bit on some of the ways that we talk about Darwin in this book, and that's okay. And look, Darwin was an abolitionist, and he also was dealing at the time with scholarly thinking that the different races of humans descended from different primates, that we weren't even one species. And so he spends a lot of his chapter on human race differences just destroying that idea and saying, look, the evidence is overwhelming that we are a single species. And then he struggles with how human biological differences, which are real, are clustered. And he really struggles with that, but he doesn't then take the next step to say, and maybe it's because humans exist on a continuum and you can't divide us up into these arbitrary categories, which is how we now think about human race, that human race is a cultural construct. It's something we've just made up. And then we put people into those bins when really humans exist on a biological continuum. And we don't cluster in these categories as neatly and nicely as everyone thinks. But Darwin does it anyway. And then his, as we already discussed, the next sort of big problem is he then thinks about it in a hierarchical way. And that to me is the most disappointing because, he's the tree thinker. He's the one that, puts all living things on the same plane and says, look, living things exist today. They are related to each other. They share ancestry through time. This isn't, a hierarchical ladder progression. Evolution isn't progress. Instead, it's these things surviving today that share ancestry through time. And he very well could have done that with human populations, but it just shows you the power of bias, and how we all have to be aware of it, and we all have to question why, even today, 150 years later, as a scientist, when I think a certain thing, when I interpret data a particular way, I need to think about why I'm doing that.
And that seems like a real message or theme of the book then, is to kind of, by looking back at the wonderful ideas and how forward thinking, but also how fallible someone like Darwin was, who's a bit of a hero of prehistory or prehistorical understanding and evolution understanding. By looking back at that, it seems like it keeps you grounded in what you know, but also compared with what you don't know or haven't thought of yet or might never know, I guess.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, the paleoanthropology for me has just been this really humbling experience, where first is this, what an amazing thing for a species to be able to ask itself where it comes from, and then to have the gall to think that it can actually figure it out, right? And that's what we're doing. It's an amazing, and I think both honorable and I don't know. I often feel just so privileged that I get to do this, and get to sort of tell the story of my ancestors, and then use those to try to figure out why I am the way I am today. But along the way, and I haven't been doing this for too long, along the way, what you realize is that we've only been doing this for about 100 years. The first fossils from Africa were discovered literally 100 years ago, 1921. That's not a long time. We haven't applied DNA to these questions until the last 50 years, which is really one or two generations of scientists, and that's it. So this is a young science, which means there's a ton we're probably missing, and there's so much out there that we still haven't discovered. And so even in the last decade, there have been things discovered, like I talked about earlier with Australopithecus Sediba, that I didn't think were possible. Like, I didn't think that creature with a foot like that could have existed. And yet there it is. Its physical remains are in my hand. Like, it existed. And so it's this wonderful awakening that there's a lot more out there to be discovered. And that's awesome. That's fun. That's one of the things, that's one of the joys of science.
Yeah.
But it requires you to be nimble and to be okay with being wrong. And that's hard. It's really hard. And that gets into sort of the humanity of science. Science, as objective as we want it to be, it's being done by emotional primates. And so there's going to be subjectivity to it, and there's going to be bias to it. And we just have to recognize that and call on each other, or call out each other when we see that.
Cynically, you could say back in Victorian times, it's very beneficial for men to be known as the just hierarchically better developed, more intelligent, as well as white European. There was an advantage to it. Was he just kind of fitting in with that on a conscious level? Or you could, I guess, again, in his defense, you could argue that human beings on the face of it, on the surface, are so varied to us, I think. They're so adaptable in different environments that you, not excusing what he thought, but given that he lived in a culture that appeared to have the most technological advancement, and he was probably unaware of things like how few people there would have been around at certain times. So people would have been isolated in pockets for years, but now they're all obviously, interchanging. I guess you could almost, no, he was a racist and a sexist, and but the book itself is a fantastic collection of not just your work, it's lots of different people writing about different ideas. And
God, I couldn't have written this book on my own. I was so fortunate to work with a dozen colleagues who had expertise in each of these areas that Darwin wrote about. And the way we tackled it was we did it chapter by chapter. We said, okay, Darwin's chapter number 1, he lays out the embryological and comparative anatomy evidence for that humans evolved. And so what do we know today about embryology, comparative anatomy? And we know a lot more because of genetics. And Alice Roberts, Professor Alice Roberts, wrote that chapter. And it's
I'm glad you name dropped Alice.
Oh, she just, such a brilliant chapter. And then Darwin went into the brain and behavior, and we have Susanna Herculano-Huzel, who's a brain expert, and Brian Hare, who studies behavior in dogs and in bonobos, which are cousins of chimpanzees. Those 2 chapters then follow, and then Johannes Haley Selassie talks about the human fossil record. Christina Kilgrove then writes the parallel chapter to Darwin's chapter 5, in which he talks about civilization and sort of the archaeology that we know about the origins of and development of so-called civilization. And that's a tough chapter to read. That's where Darwin begins to sort of espouse some pretty backward racist ideas, and Christina Kilgrove takes him to task for it, as she should. And then chapter 6 gets into the sort of bigger picture, what humans' place in the family tree. Chapter 7 gets into race differences, and Agustin Fuentes handles that chapter. John Hawkes does the one before. And then we get into sexual selection. And instead of doing chapter by chapter with sexual selection and turn this into a 500-page book, we didn't want to do that, and we wanted it to be readable. And so we boiled sexual selection down into one chapter. And Michael Ryan, who studies sexual selection mostly in frogs, handled that chapter. And then the application of sexual selection to humans, and where Darwin's ideas of sex differences emerge in his chapters 19 and 20. Holly Dunsworth writes that. And then Ann Gibbons, who's a science journalist, writes the final chapter, in which she kind of lays out, she takes a bird's eye view, and only a science journalist could do that, because the rest of us are all specialists. We specialize in our tiny little areas of the science, and she's been able to to sort of see this bigger picture. And so she writes this beautiful final chapter. And then the book starts, I should mention, the book starts with historian Janet Brown writing about the historical context in which Darwin wrote Descent of Man. So it's an amazing group of people that all, it really worked with me to see through the vision I had for this book, which was, yes, to reflect on Darwin's Descent of Man, but to use it to sort of illustrate how science works. That, when a figure like Darwin writes a book like Descent of Man, we don't hero worship and wave it around and say, this is the word, that these are the unfallible words of a brilliant scholar. As scientists, our responsibility is to actually challenge those ideas and test them with evidence and say, okay, which ideas still hold up, if any, and many still do, and which ideas don't. And if we can do that with Darwin, if we can do that with, sort of an icon of our science, then we can do that with any of these ideas that people pitch.
If people are interested in reading the book, where do they get hold of it?
So it is published through Princeton University Press. Mm-hmm. We had an amazing editor there, Alice Collette. And so if you go to Princeton University Press and look up the title of the book, A Most Interesting Problem, or my last name, DeSilva, of the Woods, right?
Of the Woods,
yeah. Of the Woods.
Then
you can find
Silver, don't Silver of the Woods.
Right. Okay. Exactly. You can find the book that way. It's gotten some nice reviews so far from folks, and I think I'm pleased with the final product.
Okay, and you should be. What I'm going to do now, just before I let you go, quick fire questions. I try and remember to do them with every guest. Okay. Again, they don't always end up being quick fire, but that's probably the nature of my questioning as much as anything. But okay, first one: if you could go back to one era and just be there for like a day and observe it, where would you go?
I would go to Africa about 7 million years ago, and to see the body form and this locomotion of the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees. There's a fierce debate in our field right now of whether it was a knuckle walker, some arboreal biped, something different from anything living today. We really don't know. So I would want to know what the last common ancestor looked like.
So actually, you wouldn't be, if we had a time machine, you couldn't actually put a date in. You'd have to find last common ancestor. Oh
yeah, right. And maybe it wouldn't even take me to East Africa. Wouldn't that be?
You end up in, I don't know, Alaska somewhere.
Otherwise, if I had to put a specific date in, and I'd spend the day with Lucy, okay. and just there's so many things we think we know about her, but it'd be nice to, that's the frustrating thing about our science, is that we'll interpret these old bones and it makes sense given the shapes of the bones, what these ancient extinct things were doing, but we can't ever put an Australopithecus on a treadmill as much as we'd like to. And so spending the day with Lucy, I think would be pretty.
It awesome. Sounds like it's going to be a tough day for her if you're going to put her on a treadmill all day.
Yeah, exactly.
She might not want to spend the day with you. I mean, I would, but she might think, what is that? Like, that's a strangely familiar thing. Not you personally, but just like any Homo sapiens.
Yeah. She kept fleeing into the trees to get away from me. Yeah.
And if it was a tie-up between being able to go back to Lucy's time, and you can take like some family, friends, you can take a bit of a quick, your house maybe, would you go back there and stay there?
Oh, no.
No. Everyone else.
I wouldn't.
I need to get rid of it, really.
I wouldn't last 24 hours.
Well, you've got your house and stuff, so you can hole up there. But
okay. All right.
Yeah.
And observe out the windows, with my binoculars and
you could take the odd trip out, but it would be. You wouldn't be. The trouble is then as well, you wouldn't be able to tell anyone about anything you found out. So it would be.
Oh right.
Yeah, that would be rubbish. So if you put like Usain Bolt up against any other species of hominid. Who's winning that race? Is it Usain every time?
I think it's Usain. I think it's Usain every time.
Okay.
Yep.
Standard. What about me, or just like a standard person?
Yeah. So what little we know about Homo erectus from the Nariokotome skeleton from Kenya is really interesting in terms of his leg length and his pelvis dimensions, and I think he might give us a run for our money.
Maybe over a distance if they were running around.
Yeah.
And last question. Of those skulls behind you, what's your favorite? Or if there's another item on there that I can't, so what's your favorite object on that sort of setup that you've got going on? I mean, well, prehistory object. If you've got family,
that's like asking me who my favorite kid is. That's.
Oh, really? Have you got that many kids? Because that must be.
I've got two. I've got twins. So this is, this comes back to something we talked about earlier. This is one of my favorite fossils. It's a femur from Kenya. It's about 2 million years old, and it has a healed spiral fracture. And so there's this big callus right here. And I love this fossil because it reminds me again that, especially during COVID times when we're all sort of feeling isolated and we're all feeling vulnerable and that we face difficult times and we get through it by helping each other out. That's what this fossil tells us, is that this individual broke their leg and it didn't kill them. So, the only way they could have survived is if other members of the group carried them to a tree or helped them get over to a tree and then brought them food. A fractured femur, I mean, you're talking at least 6 weeks of immobilization. And then oh God. It's a long time. And yet this individual lived. Even back then.
But you wouldn't get that now because everyone would be like, "Oh, I'm socially distancing. I can't go near you. You look in a lot of pain, but I've not got my mask." All that business.
I love fossils that and every fossil sort of tells a story, right? These are remains from individuals who lived and breathed and had a life. But some of these stories are a little more extraordinary. And healed fracture certainly is one of those. But
again, that's another that's a great way to end it, because again, that's another thing that I love about this, learning about this topic, is you've got these kind of generalized ideas, these kind of species that evolved this time and we did this at this time, this sort of timeline, this factuality of it, and then in amongst that you've got these wonderful stories, these very human stories that we can see. And
exactly.
That's where the beauty is. Thank you ever so much for your time, Jeremy. I'm sorry if it's been a bit meandering and odd.
No, it's great. It's been great, Sam.
I had fun, even if no one else does. So that's obviously important.
That's right. No, I had a great time. I'm glad we were finally able to do this. And I'm happy to do it. So, I mentioned my other book, which comes out in April. And so if you want to chat again after that comes out, I'm happy to do it.
100%. And by then, maybe Nike Air Force One would have sponsored me. So if nothing else, I might be able to swing you a free pair of Nike Air Force Ones.
Exactly.
But, I also mentioned Doritos, if they want to send us some free stuff. Anyone really. I'm willing to be sponsored by. All right.
Sounds
Thanks
fantastic.
for putting that with me, Jeremy. Oh, he's gone. Okay. I was going to do like a little. Well, I was going to pause it and then talk to him and say thanks for doing it properly, and then I was going to do this bit, the recording afterwards, which I realise I'm now doing and sounding like a plonker. But he obviously could not wait to get out of there quick enough. I hope he enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it. Give me some feedback, all right? There are a few people listening. I know there are. I know one of them's with Dad, and he may have listened to it the sort of 100 odd times that we get. But if you are listening, email me, bunchofapes@gmail.com, or message on Facebook, or, put it on the iTunes reviews are bloody handy. I'm trying to figure out how to do my own under a pseudonym, but you've got to have an account. So as many of them as possible. Good ones. If you don't like it, just keep it to yourself. You don't need to share that, do you? But yeah, bunch of apes. Thanks for listening. The more listens I get, the more shares I get, the bigger it grows, the more brilliant guests like Jeremy I can get on, and hopefully people can learn from him, even if they have to put up with my ramblings in between. Thank you for listening.